All right, how about now? By God. Hopefully you will be able to see my ugly mug, and I apologize yet again. I wish there were people I could talk to about this, but everyone who uses this software, this webcam and all the rest, they're on PCs generally. So we will see. Hopefully King Salmon Fish is in. Apparently there is a lag, like there was last time. Now my question for everyone is whether or not there is a way to deal with this lag. Any ideas? I'm going to delete the previous stream. Hopefully everyone will come over from that. All right, so how am I looking in terms of lag, ladies and gentlemen? How bad is it? Audio input is from the camera. It's a Brio 4K, and it is the camera and the microphone are built in all in one. Okay, so this is working. It only took me 6 minutes. I'm so proud of myself. And again, my apologies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very sorry to put all of you through this, especially since I think I've created like 4 or 5 live streams and had to quit each one. Okay, so this is working. Happy Sunday evening. We have a number of things in store for you, that being me, myself, and I. Let's see, we have a bit of strategy for the dissident right about long-term thinking and its importance. We're going to be taking a look at the metaphysical poets, a group of English poets that are personal favorites of mine. And then we'll do Ask Me Anything. So I will be running this until about midnight. Hopefully I will be entertaining, at least to whatever degree is necessary to make up for putting you all through this crap. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes to get in here. I'll take a look at the chat momentarily, but as usual, ladies and gentlemen, you should be aware that I can't follow chat very closely or I become all fucked up and tangled up in my thoughts. So I will briefly review this and say hello to everyone, and then I will get started. We've got Stoli the Wise, King Salmonfish, Waterpenny. Good to see you. Karen O'Donovan, Nova Statera, Sabrina C1 is in the house. Anon Leibovitz, yes, Man Ray of Hope, 23, Skidoo Sir, right on, yes indeed. All sorts of people are here, lovely. Philosophicat is in the house. I'm so glad that I have a moderator here, and I'm happy to see you here in any case, but I'm very happy to have a moderator here. Okay, so it seems a few people are in here. I've kept everyone waiting for long enough. So let's get started with some thoughts on the dissident right. Oh man, see, this is what happens when I see the chat. I'm gonna make this a pop out because I was just told that I said philosophicat wrong. Okay, I'm making this a pop out chat and I'm moving it over here where everyone will suffer as much as I do. All right, so the first thing that I will cover this evening, apologies, philosophicat. I will be talking a bit about, and not all that much about, some recent thoughts I had about strategy on the dissident right. And this came to me when I was listening to a live stream that Morgoth just did. You will, most of you, I believe, I hope, will be familiar with Morgoth. To put you in the context, he's the guy who starts all his clips with, "Hello again there, folks." It was a great stream, and it was interesting to listen to these guys talk about the things that concerned them and to see them try to constructively come up with ways to do something about it. But it seemed to me that there were a number of ways in which they were kind of fighting their way back through the territory that's already kind of been covered in terms of like how best to deal with it. Hopefully, what I mean by that will become clear in a moment. Essentially, they're talking about problems with so-called grooming gangs, the herds of rapists that apparently roam the streets of many cities in the United Kingdom, particularly in the north part of England. And they were talking about ways, for example, to see to it that those who are responsible for such things, or those who are very much overrepresented in being responsible for such things would no longer have access to the women who are being abused. And that, of course, brought up all kinds of ideas as regards segregation and the rest. And I was thinking to myself, well, have they not listened to people along the lines of Jared Taylor, who has taken a look at this whole issue and has seen that probably the most civil and therefore the most useful way to fight your way into the middle of that and begin to make space for your ideas would be through the use of the term freedom of association. And instead they're talking about, cutting off physical access, and then they're talking about things like segregation and how you can get from segregation to, deportation. And I have to wonder if the real idea about all of it is as much finding an effective way to do something about it as it is venting one's understandable fury about it. And so it kind of occurred to me, we say things like it's not a good idea to go and go grocery shopping when you're really hungry. Very often you'll come away with a cart full of stuff you don't need because you were trying to address that immediate concern about your immediate hunger and the growling in your stomach rather than thinking ahead properly. I think it would be fair to say that by the same token, if you will, you should not be crafting strategy when you're furious. Now, none of that is to say that there is not good reason to be furious. And in Morgoth's case, he seems to be a bit closer to the epicenter of all of it than any of us. Certainly people like me who are, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic, who are not looking at that happen in the midst of our own community. So I want it to be very clear. I'm not trying to throw attitude here, and it's perfectly understandable. But how shall I put this? There's the old statement that I love from Dune, which is the slow blade penetrates the shield, and I've always liked it because I think there is wisdom in that expression, or there is value in it for those who will contemplate it. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there is a need to view this across a broader scale of time, and bear with me, because I realize, there are many things that can be said about that assertion. You could say, well, that's all fine and good. Think about it across a broad span of time. And by the time you're halfway through the process, we'll be 20 years past the crisis. The idea is that we need to act now. I get that, but allow me to get this out, because it bears on things like choosing the best path forward. I think it bears on things like not forming strategy when you're furious. But again, you'll have to bear with me for a moment. The first thing I want to point out is that if you cannot act across time, then whatever it is that you do will not last across time, because those two things are one and the same. And so people who generally think within a more narrow temporal framework, if you will, or across a shorter span of time, they are, through that very thing that they're doing, engaging in a different game than the long-term game. And some of these things get expressed rather indirectly in a way that you have to spend a bit of time meditating upon. With the old joke about the young bull and the old bull, it's now been told many times on this channel, and even before I told it, many people had heard it before. But you got the young bull and the old bull up at the top of the hill. The young bull looks down, sees the beautiful cows, and says, let's run down and fuck some cows. And the old bull says, no, let's walk down and fuck all of them. Another old expression that kind of bears on what I'm talking about is to change the course of a mighty river. It's enough to shift a small pebble if you do so far enough upstream. Another way to look at it is something that I brought up in the past, and I wasn't as clean about expressing it as I should be, but people came into the comment section and set me right with that. So I'm going to say it very succinctly. You can have things good, fast, or cheap, or pick any two out of those three. And since we're not fabulously wealthy like, Soros folks or those who've been subverting institutions for so long, we don't have the option of having something fast. So there's the idea of good and cheap. but probably not fast. Now, that doesn't mean that we should simply set aside any ideas about taking immediate action when confronted with immediate issues. And I'll get to an explanation for what I mean by that. But what I want to bring up just before I do that is the importance of institutionalizing actions. A short-term action is simply that. It's a flash in the pan. It has a gnat's life. It's like a mayfly. It's what you do. And, I often joke about it. What's the difference between this phone in the air and the phone there on the top of my desk? It's a few instants, and yet it's no longer suspended in the air before me. It's all over. It's an action. But if we think about institutionalizing actions and meditate on, the young bull and the old bull, or shift a small pebble far enough upstream, or for example, think about the ends versus the means, and that point of view that holds that the means are the ends. You have to bear these things in mind, and with those things in mind, think about institutionalizing all actions. You want to establish ways of doing things. And it's more about a way of doing thing and a place one occupies, I think, than it is about the metaphor of linear action. One of the things that Morgoth and the others were talking about, I think it was Morgoth who said it, he's like, how do we get from A to B, but not just from A to B, but all the way over to X, Y, and Z? And there was recognition in that of the fact that there's steps that need to be taken in sequence, and choices about which things happen first and which things happen second and third have a lot to do with whether or not there's any hope of success. But that's a linear metaphor. You're going from A to B, and you're going from B to C, and on to X, Y, and Z. It's a linear metaphor. It's about movement. And I think that there are things about the metaphor of movement versus the metaphor of growth that would be useful for those who want to undertake strategic thinking to consider. Movement metaphors are easier to subvert, I believe. People who think in terms of movement are easier to subvert than those who think in terms of growth. So think about, let's take what is at least superficially considered a feminine pastime, which is gardening. You're trying to grow something in place. You have a view across time, but you're standing in the same place. You don't change your location. You prepare the soil. You make sure it's fertile. You prepare the seeds. You plant them in the right way. Maybe they want to be wet. Maybe they want to be a little bit dry. They have to be treated, in a particular way, given the plant and its roots. And you have a vision across time of a thing that will be. There is a certain extent that structuralism is true, insofar as it does seem to me anyway, that habits of thinking and the adherence to a given set of metaphors shape how we think about a thing. And because these metaphors are always approximations, you can almost get lost in them. And so with linear thinking of how to get from A to B and from B to X, Y, and Z, whether or not we'll first, divide the offending class of persons in question from the victims that they target, and whether or not that in turn will then lead to the removal of people from a given geographical territory. That's very much about, we're going to do this and then move to this and to this. And you can say, yeah, it's just a metaphor, Oliver. They realize that they're not actually running about on a board. But after a fashion, they are, if they don't sit and meditate about the metaphor of bringing a thing into existence right before you. There being no need to move in space because one's frame of reckoning is in time. That, I think, is what I have in mind when I talk about institutionalizing one's actions. Because then you're not rushing to and fro, pell-mell, helter-skelter, pick, whatever old expression you like. I think there's something valuable to that, particularly given what you have with the human ability to foresee things in the future and how subject that is to distortion, inaccuracies that get multiplied and become a cascading series of failures over time. So if anybody is ever involved in orienteering, the use of a compass, navigation, some of the people who are watching I know have had military training, so you must have had some basic, work with compass and the rest and maps. When you're taking your reading and you're going to be crossing an area of forest, you have to pick a landmark. And when you're in thick brush, you very often have to pick a tree that might just be, one of the few things that you can see clearly and distinguish and use as a point of orientation as you move. And it might be a tree that's only, 50 yards off. And you're walking towards it, and then you have to take another bearing. And with each bearing, over time, unless you're very careful, depending on how often you take those bearings, you might find that you get to the place where your target is supposed to be and you're 2 miles off in the woods. And needless to say, the further the distance you travel, even with a minuscule difference in your reading based on where you go, you can end up being miles and miles off. And the further you have to go, ultimately, it's there's a direct correspondence there with how far off you end up at the end. The further you go with a bad reading, the further off you are at the point when you thought you were going to arrive, and yet you didn't. It has much in common with firing a rifle. The further away it is, these tiny little variations there. If you pull the trigger too hard and jerk the weapon, you find out that you're 3 feet off downrange. And so that has bearing too, in terms of thinking across time. And so I think one of the ways that you can work to institutionalize things, and hopefully I'll remember to come back to ways in which that can happen. One of the ways to do that is to consider things, as I said, not as moving between points, but perhaps something that's more like a gardening metaphor or a growth metaphor in place. Well, yeah, I want to talk about how our opponents, plural, have been thinking across a broader timescale than we do. But before I do that, I better jump over, or I'm going to forget, to this whole idea of institutionalizing actions. There are any number of ways culturally that we institutionalize actions. We can institutionalize words by writing them down. There's an old line in Dark Crystal where they're talking to the Gelflings, and he's like, "Oh, we're writing words that stay." But the point is that they become relatively lasting. You institutionalize a statement by writing it down. Otherwise, it blows away on the wind. The vibrations cease to hang suspended in the air and tickle your inner ear. There are ways that we do this culturally. One of them is with written culture. Now, we are very simple-minded in how we think about writing. We think that it comes after language. I believe it's quite the opposite. And so we don't take into account things like territorial marking and the rest, and how all that bears upon all the marks and signs, non-linguistic marks and signs we see deployed in our environment. So that goes down to flags and banners, border markings, clan insignia, property marks, team insignia, marks upon currency. That forms a continuum all the way across with writing. And all these things will help us to establish a lastingness to what we do. We'll institutionalize our actions. You can see that very clearly with the idea of people who write books in order to make sure that their ideas are out there and can be referenced. Greg Johnson writes a White Nationalist Manifesto. He's attempting to make his action lasting and furthermore communicable. He's attempting to grow a thing. When you take a look at somebody like No White Guilt, Jason, and of course Jared as well, they're focusing on community, because they realize that there's nothing to mobilize if people don't recognize who they are and how that corresponds to how they fit in with the community. This is long-term thinking. Another example is material culture, and that's a very broad thing. It can be as simple as a token. I've got this little necklace from the Camargue that reminds me of some aspects of my Catholic roots that I do not wish to dispense with, though I am not a Catholic. It reminds me of the Pauline virtues of faith, hope, and charity, or Marie sur la Mer coming up out of the sea, and the Jardins with their goads on horseback and their old medieval style saddles, near the sea in the Camargue in southern France. It's a token. Or my mother, who brought a pine cone back from some island she had been on in Greece near a temple, and she used it to remind her of things. It can be like people who bring back dirt from Jerusalem after making the pilgrimage, or water from the well of Zamzam for Muslims who make their pilgrimage. And it can move beyond tokens up to institutionalized tokens, which are conventional and help us to remember things as a culture. These are like, statues of Confederate soldiers that get knocked down, or or the Vietnam Memorial, or Nelson's column, if I'm remembering all that right. But it can go further to what we think of as architecture that shapes our behavior across time. We can institutionalize relationships by having doors that open for certain groups and don't for others. Upstairs entrances for those who are of the proper class, downstairs entrances in back for those who are of working class or who are maids or people who are making deliveries, dumping coal in the chute or bringing milk in the truck. That can institutionalize human behavior. What I don't see in the short-term reactions driven by quite understandable fury at what's going on is that long-term plan. And now a lot of people will jump in and say, as I said, you're thinking 50 years down the road, that's all well and good, but at the moment we're facing a very immediate crisis. And I grant that this is the case, but you have to bear in mind multiple tracks of action. You can have successful long-term action and successful short-term action. They can coexist. They're not mutually exclusive. I'm not saying don't do this, do this. I'm saying that it must have a broader context. So for example, you don't talk about creating segregated ghettos for Asian grooming gang demographics. You talk about, for example, things like freedom of association and perhaps freedom of association and how that could work with schools, because you're not coming straight out of the gate that causes everyone to bow up and get their hackles up and freak out. And I get that there's a thing of, well, we just can't keep, quietly tiptoeing around this. Well, then again, the question is, do you wish to be successful or not? Do you wish to make the situation worse? Because the one thing everyone should bear in mind is that as awful as it is, it can be worse. Believe that. Now, we know that you can have successful long-range action, consideration of a wider span of time, without short-range action. And we know that you can have long-range action and short-range action together, but you cannot have successful short-term action without long-range action, simply because without the latter, the former is doomed. So institutionalize. You see what I'm saying? No matter how successful the short-term action is, unless it is part of a bigger picture, a plan to institutionalize and make lasting these things that you have undertaken, then they're doomed to be a flash in the pan. They are ephemera. They're like falling leaves that get blown away with the change of season or more quickly. So just to be clear, I'm not punching right. I'm not saying anything negative about the people in question. Morgoth in particular, I don't know why he's just fucking likable. I've never seen anybody with whom I have such fundamental agreements. I disagree with him about the cause of the problem in large part, but not about its nature, if you'll allow such an expression. I disagree with him about the solution of the problem, but certainly not about the need for one. So I'm not here to rag on Morgoth. I think he's great. And I love the way he says, "Power." What I am here to do is to say that whatever you think about in short term that is in reaction to what you think is an immediate crisis, and certainly in this case it should be nested within a wider and broader temporal strategy. So I wanted to get this out, and ways of doing that are material culture, they're books, they're written culture. There is ritual, both in the sense we normally think about it, like mass is a ritual, it's a cultural ritual. Patrolling borders is a ritual that goes all the way back to stress responses and rogational processions. But there is also the dimension of ritual that we talk about in the scientific study of animal behavior, in ethology. It's ritual in that sense too, encoded behavior that has presumably intraspecific or even interspecific survival value. We have a number of ways that we can institutionalize these things and make them lasting. But if you're in this furious response, if you're trying to plan strategy when when your piss is boiling, then perhaps it's time to take a breath. I'm not saying, again, that there is no cause to be upset. I'm talking about whether or not your focus is on displaying how angry you are, or if it's on success. So we know that the opponent thinks across broader timescales. That's where we get expressions like the slow march through the institutions. So surely anyone with sense will realize that when faced with an opponent who thinks the slow march through the institutions. So surely anyone with sense will realize that when faced with an opponent who thinks across a broader scale of time, that opponent is not likely to have real problems when he's dealing with those who are approaching it from the perspective of a short-term reaction. I hope that that is clear. I've already expressed that even without an opponent actively attempting to thwart you and to bring about a different set of circumstances, even without that, even if you're not facing that, if you only think about short-term solutions and you don't institutionalize each step in order to make it lasting, it becomes a very, very questionable enterprise, because it's unlikely to last beyond the action itself. If I say hello, where's that word now? But if I write it down, it stays. Again, this is just a metaphor, but you have to be thinking this way so that whatever is gained is kept. And there is an incremental growth, and there is momentum, as people like to say. So if we've got an opponent who thinks across various timescales, who's capable of acting in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term, certainly in those circumstances, we need to be thinking long term as well. I mean, you've got the perspective of short-term reaction versus long-term action. The former is reactionary. I wonder if it's a coincidence that people refer to right-wing folks as reactionaries. That bears thinking about, right? And whenever anything is reactionary, the expression too little, too late comes to mind, not least because of the whole thing about, good, cheap, or fast. We have to be thinking ahead because we're the ones who are limited with resources. We're the ones who are being pushed out of the chairs, the thrones, the seats, the cathedra that we occupy. The seats of office is what I mean by all of that. The institutional seats of control within these cultural structures. We're the ones who don't currently occupy them, which is why we must think across time. The slow blade penetrates the shield. To shift a mighty river, to change the course of a mighty river, it's enough to shift a small pebble far upstream. So it's all about long-term moves on the board. And I wanted to bring that up because I think that with any of these things that are under consideration, again, they have to be contextualized. So the question is, where will it all go? And how useful will it really be? Because never forget, as we're likely to see, or at least it's possible we'll see with the upcoming demonstrations in Virginia, a lot of people think it can be worse. Believe me, it can be worse. Everybody remembers how the entire position that those on the dissident right occupied was radically shifted by the events in Charlottesville. So, yeah, things could shift yet further. All right, so that was something I wanted to cover. Again, I have nothing but respect for the guys I heard talking, and it was a very interesting talk indeed. Again, for the life of me, I can't help but like Morgoth. God knows why. And in particular, the Endeavor guy was quite bright too. I thought he had a number of interesting things to say. I just thought I would throw that in there as my response. So now we have metaphysical poets. How is it that I know about metaphysical poets? I hope you guys will stick around for this because these guys are badass. These are not men that you would typically associate with poetry. This was an entirely different crew from the late 16th century and up through much of the 17th century. And I first became aware of them when I was listening to an album by Current 93, which occasionally is entirely out of tune, but I liked it when I was younger, quite a bit. And a number of the lyrics for the songs that David Tibet put together in that album, again, Earth Covers Earth by Current 93, they're simply poems written by these so-called metaphysical poets. And so I wrote to David Tibet back in the day, who was very well known for always writing people back. And in fact, he did. And I asked him about those lyrics, and he said I should go out and get the Penguin Classics of the Metaphysical Poets, which is what he had, edited by Helen Gardner of Oxford, Fellow of the British Academy, and Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford, and Honorary Fellow at Lady Margaret Hall and St. Hilda's College. And it's actually a great little paperback, and her introduction is quite good. You'll be hearing a bit about it. When did I get this? I think I kept the receipt. This was back when you went to bookstores and paid at a counter. I got this book in, good God, 1994. Wow. Okay. So I'm going to read to you a bit about these poets from her introduction very quickly, and then we will jump to these poems. Again, I hope you will stick around. We'll do AMA afterwards, but these are really quite good. A couple of them I have recited before at various times on my channel, but I'll have some new stuff as well. And anyone who is into the literary heritage of England and some of its finest poets would want to hear about this, I would think. As well as those who aren't even over there in Old Blighty, who would be just interested in good poetry. Okay, so this very quickly I'll read. This is from, what's her name, Gardner's introduction. The term metaphysical poets came into being long after the poets to whom we apply it were dead. Samuel Johnson, who coined it, did so with the consciousness that it was a piece of literary slang, that he was giving a kind of nickname when he wrote in his Life of Cowley that about the beginning of the 17th century appeared a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets. His quote, may be termed, end quote, indicates that he did not consider that these poets had the right to be called metaphysical in the true sense. He was adapting a witty sally from Dryden, who, in writing in 1693, said of Donne, that is John Donne, he affects the metaphysics, not only in his satires, but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts, and entertain them with the softness of love. In this, Mr. Cowley has copied him to a fault. Between Dryden and Johnson comes Pope, who is reported by Spence to have remarked that Cowley, as well as Davenant, borrowed his metaphysical style from Donne, end quote. But the only writer I know of before Dryden who spoke as if there were a metaphysical school is Drummond of Hawthornden, 1585 to 1649, who, in an unfortunately undated letter, speaks of poets who make use of metaphysical ideas and scholastical quiddities. What we call metaphysical poetry was referred to by contemporaries as strong lines, a term which calls attention to other elements in metaphysical poetry than its fondness for indulging in nice speculations of philosophy in unusual contexts. The term is used in connection with prose as well as with verse. Indeed, the earliest use I know of is by a prose writer, and so invites us to look at metaphysical poetry in a wider context. Like the term metaphysical, the term strong-lined is a term of disapprobation. It too is a kind of slang, a phrase which would seem to have been coined by those who disliked this way of writing. Thus Burton, in the preface to the Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, by the way, that is an absolutely fantastic book, although a staggeringly large one. The Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, Burton, in the preface, contrasts his own loose free style with neat composition, strong lines, hyperboles, allegories, and later speaks disparagingly of the affectation of big words, fustian phrases, jingling terms, strong lines that, like Acastes' arrows, caught fire as they flew, and quarrels, in the preface to Argolus and Parthenia, 1629, declares, I have not affected to set thy understanding on the rack by the tyranny of strong lines, which, as they fabulously report, china dishes, are made for the third generation to make use of, and are the mere itch of wit, under the colour of which many have ventured, trusting to the Oedipean conceit of their ingenious reader, to write nonsense, and feloniously father the created expositions of other men, not unlike some painters, who first make the picture, then, from the opinions of better judgments, conclude whom it resembles. These are complaints against an established manner in prose and verse. It is a manner which developed in the last decade of the 16th century with the cry everywhere for more matter and less words. In prose, Cicero, the model for the 16th century, was dethroned in favor of the silver Latin writers, Seneca and Tacitus. Recommending Sir Henry Saville's translation of Tacitus in 1591, Anthony Bacon commends Tacitus because he hath written the most matter with the best conceit in the fewest words of any historiographer, and adds, but he is hard, difficilia, atque pulchra. The second reading will please thee more than the first, and the third than the second. This is an important thing about how these verses need to be chewed for the many dimensions of their meaning, but I return now to her text. The same conception that difficulty is a merit is applied to the poetry in Chapman's preface to Ovid's Banquet of the Sense, 1595, where he declares that poetry, unlike oratory, should not aim at clarity, that poetry should be as pervial as oratory, and plainness her special ornament, with a plain way to barbarism. Poetry, like prose, that was a quote, poetry, like prose, should be close-packed and dense with meaning, something to be chewed and digested, which will not give up its secrets on a first reading. In the 1590s, also, formal satire appeared in English, and the satirists took as their model Persius, the most obscure of Roman satirists, and declared that satire should be hard of conceit and harsh of style. The same period sees the vogue of the epigram and the great popularity of Martial. Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost done. Please bear with me. What came to be called by its denigrators the strong-lined style, had its origins in this general desire at the close of Elizabeth's reign for concise expression, achieved by an elliptical syntax, and accompanied by a staccato rhythm in prose and a certain deliberate roughness in versification in poetry. Along with this went admiration for difficulty in the thought. For difficulty in the thought. Difficulty is indeed the main demerit in this way of writing for those who dislike it. And the constant complaint of its critics is that it confuses the pleasures of poetry with the pleasures of puzzle. And by God, that's what makes me love it. Returning to the text, it is one of its merits for those who approve it. Jasper Mayne, in his Elegy on Donne, put his finger on one of the delights of reading strong-line verse when he said, "We are thought wits when 'tis understood." It makes demands upon the reader and challenges him to make it out. It does not attempt to attract the lazy, and its lovers have always a certain sense of being a privileged class, able to enjoy what is beyond the reach of vulgar wits. The great majority of the poets included in this book did not write to be read by all and sundry. Few of them published their poems. They were chamber poets, as Drayton, with the jealousy of the professional for the amateur, complains. Their poems passed from hand to hand in manuscript. This is a source of both weakness and strength. At times, the writing has the smell of a coterie, the writer performing with a self-conscious eye on his clever readers. But at its best, it has the ease and artistic sincerity which comes from being able to take for granted the understanding of the audience for whom one writes. And that is all I will read of the introduction, and that was in all likelihood too much. We will go with some examples, starting with one of my great favorites, this one by Sir Walter Raleigh. Some of you may have heard it before. And this just goes to show that there was a wide span of time, certainly more than 100 or about 100 years or so, that the poets who could be called metaphysical were working, perhaps a bit less than 100 years, somewhere in there. And Raleigh is arguably one of the first of them, though you would not perhaps call him strictly a metaphysical poet. And again, that was originally a term of mockery and abuse. Some of his poems, nevertheless, do qualify. And this in particular is one I like quite a bit. It's called What is Our Life? What is our life? A play of passion. Our mirth, the music of division. Our mother's wombs, the tiring houses be, where we are dressed for this short comedy. Heaven the judicious, sharp spectator is, that sits and marks still who doth act amiss. Our graves that hide us from the searching sun are like drawn curtains when the play is done. Thus march we, playing to our latest rest. Only we die in earnest. That's no jest. What a fucker. All right, we'll have another. There'll be just a few of these. And we'll get around to this Ask Me Anything here before too much longer. Now, this one is from a person who is considered to be sort of at the heart of this movement of the metaphysical poets, and that is John Donne. And while I would like to read several of his poems, some of them are a bit long, certainly longer than what you just heard. And he is perhaps the most difficult of the difficult ones. And so, given the fact that the language is somewhat archaic for many of you who are not accustomed to reading things from the 16th and 17th century, it might be a bit difficult to follow, but I would recommend him highly. And I would recommend this book highly because it's a great introduction. It's all really right there, or much of it. So yes, read them on your own time where you can have the words before your eyes and take time to gnaw at the meaning. But this one I think is fairly clear. And it introduces a metaphor that has been quite meaningful to me, and that is characteristic of these metaphysical poets. This one is titled A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. That's mourning with a U. And we're told in a footnote, Walton says that Donne gave these verses to his wife when he left her to go with Sir Robert Drury to France in November 1611. So we can see this very talented poet and very, very interesting thinker departing from the woman that he loves and leaving her with these words. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, whilst some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say, no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods nor sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull sublunary lovers love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence because it doth remove those things which elemented it. But we by love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, assured of the mind, careless eyes, lips and hands to miss, our two souls therefore which are one. Though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth, if the other do. And though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as it comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. Donne is great. Now we'll move to another very famous metaphysical poet, so-called metaphysical poet with the strong lines. And we'll do a couple after this, and then I will wrap and we will go to AMA. But this is Henry King. This is another one I have in the past recited. The note for this bit reads, this famous stanza provided a model for many imitations. Excuse me. This famous stanza provided a model for many imitations and parodies. It is almost always ascribed to King in manuscript collections, but it was first published in Francis Beaumont's Poems, 1640 and 1653. It bears the title, probably given it after the fact, Sic Vita, meaning, of course, thus is life. Like to the falling of a star, or as the flights of eagles are, or like the fresh spring's gaudy hue, or silver drops of morning dew, or like the wind that chased the flood, or bubbles which on water stood, even such as man whose borrowed light is straight called in and paid tonight. The wind blows out, the bubble dies, the spring entombed in autumn lies, the dew dries up, the star is shot, the flight is past, and man forgot. I still remember it. Okay, let's have another one here. No, we're not doing George Herbert. George Herbert is a famous one and thought to be very representative, but I don't care for him. All right, we have two left. Second to last one is very famous, and I can't resist it just because it's funny. And I recited some little bit of it, I think, when I was talking to Millennial Woes over Millennial. And so I will give you the full thing. Again, it's very famous. Many of you will have heard of it, but it's worth it to go through it simply for those who have not heard it. This is by Andrew Marvell. He is considered to be rather late in the chain of metaphysical poets, and much of his poetry probably does not qualify for that designator, but this one is quite famous and quite good. To his coy mistress, had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges' side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood. And you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow-chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Andrew Marvell. Many were the occasions as a young man I took a moment to meditate upon that poem, and many were the variations of that argument I made to young women. And this is the last one, ladies and gentlemen, and we will be turning then to Ask Me Anything. Thank you for your patience. This will be the last poem. It's a great favorite of mine. This one certainly is included on that old Current 93 album, Earth Covers Earth. There they call it Hourglass for Diana. Where and why Diana had to have anything to do with this, one can only wonder. It's probably some neo-pagan bullshit that they were interested in. But the original is entitled On an Hourglass. And this one, oddly enough, was written by a fellow named John Hall. And I'm not sure that we know that much about him. Let me see here in the biographical notes. He lived apparently from 1627 to 1656. Hull was educated at the grammar school of his native town of Durham and went up to St. John's College, Cambridge, 1646. In the same year, he published a book of essays, Ore Vacive. And in the following year, his poems appeared, accompanied by a chorus of encomiastic verses and dedicated to Thomas Stanley. Hull was a fervent partisan of Cromwell and is said to have been a pensioner of his. He found time before his early death at the age of 29 to combine with polemical journalism the writing of an address to Parliament concerning the advancement of learning and reformation of the universities, dated 1649, and the translating of Longinus under the title The Height of Eloquence, 1652. So we know very little of him. Here is his poem, and then we will turn to Ask Me Anything. Be aware when this poem is done, be thinking of your questions, and make sure if you are interested in addressing a question to me that you tag it with Semiogogue so I can see it outlined, flagged for me to view. Otherwise, I tend to miss them in the chat. So the last poem, ladies and gentlemen, and I thank you for your patience. On an hourglass. My life is measured by this glass, by all those little sands that through pass. See how they press, see how they strive, which shall, with greatest speed and greatest quickness fall. See how they raise a little mount, and then, with their own weight, do level it again. But when they have all got through, they give over their nimble sliding down, and move no more. Just such is man, whose hours still forward run, being almost finished ere they are begun. So perfect nothings, such light blasts are we, that ere we are aught at all, we cease to be. Do what we will, our hasty minutes fly, and while we sleep, what do we else but die? How transient are our joys, how short their day. They creep on towards us, but fly away. How stinging are our sorrows where they gain, but the least footing, there they will remain. How groundless are our hopes, how they deceive our childish thoughts and only sorrow leave. How real are our fears, they blast us still rend us, still with gnawing passions fill. How senseless are our wishes, and yet how great, with what toil we pursue them, and with what sweat. Yet most times for our hurts so small we see, like children crying for some mercury. This gapes for marriage, yet his fickle head knows not what cares wait on a marriage bed. This vows virginity, yet knows not what loneliness, grief, discontent attends that state. Desires of wealth another's wishes hold, and yet how many have been choked with gold. This only hunts for honor, yet who shall ascend the higher shall more wretched fall. This thirsts for knowledge, yet how is it bought? With many a sleepless night and racking thought. This needs will travel, yet how dangers lay, most secret ambuscados in the way. These triumph in their beauty, though it shall, like a plucked rose or fading lily, fall. Another boasts strong arms, last giants have by silly dwarves been dragged unto their grave. These ruffle in rich silk, though ne'er so gay, a well-plumed peacock is more gay than they. Poor man, what art? A tennis ball of error? A ship of glass tossed in a sea of terror, issuing in blood and sorrow from the womb, crawling in tears and mourning to the tomb. How slippery are thy paths, how sure thy fall. How art thou nothing when thou art most of all? And that, my friends, is a sampling of the metaphysical poets. And so, we have now arrived at the point in our discussion where I will be taking Ask Me Anything questions. So have them prepared for me, and I will attempt to answer quickly and with precision. All right. I will go back through this now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for being with me thus far. And I will look for questions. Some of these will be from further back. Some of them. Someone keeps telling me to go on Waffenhaus. But I am not sure what Waffenhaus is. The part of the country where I come from here in Georgia, we have a thing called Waffelhaus. Waffelhaus? Waffenhaus. I'm not sure what that is. We would love to have you as a guest on Patrick Bateman's The Waffenhaus. I don't know what that is. I will look into it. Waffenhaus wants to see if you can defend your normie take on politics. Okay, I'll have a look. We shall see. What else? I'm scrolling down here, ladies and gentlemen. Poetry's unmusical to me. All right, well. Sorry. I'm still scrolling down. Water Lily says she loves poetry. I'm glad someone enjoys it. Certainly. Haiku banditry is where it's at, yes. What else? Oh, good God. There's too much for me to make sense of there, and I don't want to keep you all waiting. Someone says Semiogogue is knowledgeable on geopolitics. I saw him on JF Stream. Yes, and I'm trying to take a break from geopolitics, by gum, with this live stream this evening. All right. No questions thus far. I'm still scrolling down. Bear with me if you've already posted some. Good gracious. Amanda Anderson says she's enjoying the poetry. I am glad, because I'd be catching hell if she didn't. Okay. Good gracious. Hopefully some of my peeps will be in the house with good questions for me. I'm just scrolling down and trying to catch up. Okay, it looks like Black Betty is an asshole. So if the assholishness continues, feel free to make that person go away. Okay, that's not a question either. This is terrible. I'm scrolling down through this with all this time. Surely. There we go. I'm at the very end, and now it appears we've got some. John's Key says, Semiogogue, what's a good way to get started reading poetry? Well, it depends on what you like. If you are interested in the dimensions of it that are, how do I put it this way? Like if you're not into, for example, the fact that it rhymes, and that sort of thing, you're more interested in just kind of getting into it. You could, for example, deal with Shakespeare, because you've got the plays, which have value in and of themselves, but it's essentially a play being told through poetry. And that is a way to get into it if it suits you, because then you can pick up a play that has meaning for you. Hamlet obviously is one that was very big for me. So pick up a play that will keep you interested because of the story aspect, because they'll have knife fights and murders and poisonings and that kind of thing. That's one aspect. Another is to take a look at a period that you're interested in. Like, I can deal with a little bit of Coleridge, and a little bit of what's his name, Byron, and some of Shelley. But for example, like Wordsworth is just, I'm like, oh God, get me out of here, man. And any number of the ones from further forward in time, they don't interest me. So you can also pick a time period that is something that calls out to you. You can also try it from subject matter. But then again, if it's not there and it's not something that you appreciate, you can't make it happen. But that's one aspect. All right, what else do we have here? Best wooing poem. Oh, well, best wooing poem. I don't know. You have to write those individually. Wooing poems should not be taken from someone else's work. You should compose and write them for the woman you're speaking to. I've written any number of wooing poems. One of them was particularly good, though. And it worked. For as long as it worked, it went like this. Maybe the sun will rise. Maybe the wall will fall. Maybe our hopes wait patiently for each of us and all. Maybe the years weren't wasted. Maybe the tales are true. It might be I was right to wait all these long years for you. The instant when the die is cast, the moment the wheel is spun. Together, fate and choice can change the course our lives will run. But alone in the uncertain night, with no light but the moon, and the hot white sparks of a burning heart, I wish you would come soon. Maybe, might be, can be, could, and the withering weight of words like should. My love, my only love, I only wish you would. So yes, the best wooing poem is one that you write with an honest and sincere heart that doesn't involve telling her she has a fat ass. Okay. Boomer says, Semiogogue, have you ever read The Guy in the Glass by Dale Wimbrough? I have not. Jonathan Pohl says, Semiogogue, I want to have Tim on my show. He is the more entertaining part of your show. Thank you for sharing your comments. Okay. Semiogogue, adherent of Lady Columbia, what should be done of this sizable number of women who view the state as a provider in the place of the husband? Would love to hear you and Tim do a video on this. I'll have to give that some thought. That's rather bigger, and I would have to think about it beforehand. It's rather a bigger topic than I could jump into right here, but I will attempt to remember that and bring it up with Tim when he is next speaking with me. Dylan asks, Semiogogue, any German poetry you enjoy? Well, of course, I read it all in translation, so, you know, whatever that's worth. And it's a very, very tenuous thing to attempt to transpose a poem from one language into another. But from what I can understand of translation, there's a little bit of Goethe, the East-West Divan, I think it's called, and some of Rilke, however the hell you pronounce his name, is interesting to me, but I don't know much about it. All right, what else do we have here? Meow Meow says, have you ever had any experiences with ghosts or shadow people? I've had experiences with what I thought of as being ghosts or something that remained. I had a house from the 1920s that I bought in a very bad neighborhood, but it's such a nice house, man. Had all kinds of crown molding inside it. It wasn't the high ceilings that I grew up with, but they were still like just short of 10 feet high. And it was all original plaster and, you know, good oak hardwood floors. I put a bunch of money, put all copper pipes back into it and ended up having to get rid of it. It was terrible. Anyway, in the back of it, apparently an old black man who'd been living there had been shot up by a hooker that he used to have over regularly. And there were a bunch of old bullet holes in the door and bullet holes in the floor. And yeah, sometimes that got a bit, created kind of an atmosphere in the house that had to be asserted back against. But that's the only thing that immediately comes to mind. Semiogogue, do you have any recommendations for poetry about love and loss? Well, there's just so many of it. You can start with, you know, Petrarch, I don't know. Let me think about that. I mean, so much of it does. What else? Gaius Nullis, Semiogogue, thanks for sharing the works of these great poets. I've also enjoyed your poems and would love to have you on my new poetry show on the White Art Collective. Please contact Jeff or myself. Yeah, depending on what the topic is. Gaius Nullis, that must be, I can't see the icon very well, but I believe that's just straight Nullis on Twitter. So yeah, shoot me a message or I will you if I can remember it. I think that's Nullis from Hungary, right? Hopefully I've got that in my mind right. What do you think of the poetry value of Wilson's Temporary Autonomous Zone, TAZ? That would be Peter Lamborn Wilson. How odd to get a TAZ question. You know, I met Peter Lamborn Wilson in New York and talked to him at some length because we were both published in the same journal. It's called Alexandria. I can't remember. I believe I read TAZ. I don't know that there's much poetry in it. I can't remember well. Peter Lamborn Wilson was a very interesting man, but one that one whose morals I absolutely cannot recommend. So I'd have to take a look again. I can't remember any poetry from it, so I can't give you any sense of whether it was good or bad. Anon Leibovitz says, Semiogogue, do you think we're in a police state at this point in America? Well, compared to any previous period in our history, yes. But it can always get worse. So there's that. Take heart. Semiogogue, favorite Confederate warlord of the steppes and horse? Well, there can be only one. I mean, obviously, all full respect must be paid to Lee. Absolutely. But just in terms of, I wouldn't say he had the character or the vision, nor was he as much of a gentleman or as interesting as Lee. But Nathan Bedford Forrest, put the skier on him and keep the skier on him. La Cava, how can complete knowledge be reconciled with genuine free will? Through manifestation, which locks us into the prison of matter and makes everything limited and contingent. Here where we paddle away far from causality. All right. What next? What is next? Haiku Bandits in the house, 575. All right. Orthodox Humor says, when are you coming over to Jesus? My opinions on that probably would not be of interest to you. Waterpenny, Semiogogue, if the long-term strategy needs writing and form, signs and signals, wouldn't that be a disadvantage when the opponent can read the signs as well? Bold and open declaration an advantage. Well, it depends. There are certain ways that those who manipulate signs and symbols, as well as all other aspects with their social engineering, there's some things that they're fully aware of, some things that they have. Tim used to distinguish between understanding, apprehension, understanding, and comprehension. Obviously, comprehend and apprehend come from Latin roots that have the idea of grabbing. Apprehension is a faint sense that something's there. The opponents have apprehensions about most of it. The opponents have understanding about a great deal, but it's, except with a few exceptions, particularly things related to dialectical manipulation, the opponents are not so well versed that you could say they comprehend. Understanding is that degree of awareness of a thing and familiarity with it, experience of and through it, that permits one to manipulate it and use it. So you can say you understand a thing at the point at which you're able to use it as a tool. But comprehension is another level up in terms of one's familiarity with a thing, the degree to which one's awareness has enveloped the various perspectives and understandings that go with the thing in question. So I guess what I'm saying in a very abstract sense, maybe some of you will be able to follow along, is that while they have understanding of any number of things, they're lacking comprehension. So, for example, they know that they can manipulate people with mercantile marks that are placed in the environment, and they know how that works, how they can drive behavior, as they like to talk about it in marketing meetings, or how they can get someone to turn off of a high traffic thoroughfare and go into a little shop. But do they know that that territorial marking or that mercantile marking and the behavioral regulation that it can be used to further, are they aware that that comes from territorial, environmental, and resource marks going back to animal behavior? Are they aware that those visible marks in space correspond for a much broader band of species on Earth? They correspond with scent marks and the way in which all of this is territorial. Have they looked at the hippocampus or place in border cells? No, they haven't. I have, and that gives me something closer to comprehension, or at least whole further scales of understanding, if nothing else, that would allow me to do things with those same tools that they might not be able to do, despite their long familiarity with them and their long exploitation of them. The same goes for, architecture, with everyone talking about, the Masons, the Masons are doing everything, and yet they don't even think about how a building shapes your behavior all by itself, whether you're a Freemason or not. They don't look, for example, at the fact that not only are Masons out of vogue, architects are too, and the one with the real power is a structural engineer. There are ways in which they don't look at how human behavior is shaped and regulated in anything other than a superficial sense, or they think down a given set of paths that are available. And so I think that it's less about whether or not it's bold and open, and more about whether or not you undertake things based on a greater understanding of the whole subject than your opponent has. All right. Did I just see something in there about having a fat ass? Oh, I missed it. I wanted to quote that one. All right. Wow, I'm way too far down. Okay. Sabrina C1 says, I want to know what sort of car you drive. An old American car, not even that old. One that is remarkable in absolutely no sense, that almost slips beneath people's conscious awareness because it's such a common American car. All right, the Swamp Thing cometh. Semiogogue, the like-minded declare a pact and work internally to accrue leverage to move the world without and look to our own to secure well-being. La Cosa Nostra was right about the family. Yes, the issue is that that if the game board is global and even one's family can be extended out to ethnic and racial groups, yes, that's the issue about, yeah, I'm not even going down that road because there's so many ways in which it could cause people to raise eyebrows and call down Fed posters upon me. Semiogogue, ever dream things before they happen, or get visited by people in your dream before they pass? Yeah, but it's all subject to interpretation, and I have the dream and then the thing happens and I say it must have meant that. So that in that respect, it's difficult to say that that I've had that happen in any way that would be convincing to anyone. But I have, by contrast, like gotten up in the morning and known that someone wrote me an email. I have gotten up or felt immediately that someone was in real pain and I had to call them even though they were thousands of miles away. Like those things I had had happen. To such an extent that there is no more doubt in my mind about, knowledge at a distance or whatever. But in terms of real prognostication, I think so, but even I tend to assume that that could just be, me fitting things to the circumstances after the fact. Semiogogue, receive, and it's from John Ski, receive any interesting things in your P.O. box yet? I was going to send whiskey, but United States Postal Service says no. I'm so sad. Thank you, by the way. Yeah, I got handmade stickers from John Goris, who's what's it called? Ghost Tank. And I'm giving careful thought to John Goris and his Ghost Tank animations. You can find him on his animations on the John Goris channel. There's something about his animation style that is a style. It's his. It doesn't seem derivative. It feels genuine. That said, at present. It's just people machine gunning each other and like spraying blood and guts everywhere. So I'm kind of thinking to myself, what could be done with John Goris's animation? So yeah, he sent me his homemade stickers, which was cool. I got a great book. Where is it? It's in the other room. It's on Indo-European, the Indo-European language and trees. And how do you put it? It's some of this crossover. It's not exactly archaeology because it has to do with botany and the rest, but it's essentially anthropological and linguistic, and it looks at what the Indo-European culture must have been like given the way in which they thought about trees, as evidenced by the types of words they had for them and how they reveal categories, our categorial thinking as regards trees, flora. Very, very interesting book. Haven't had a chance to read it yet. Yeah, and Zed Des sent me a lovely hat sometime back. All right, Water Penny. Which of today's poets would you recommend? These days, I like Eastern European poets. There's something about them, and it's not all of them. Many of them can be tedious, and you've got the whole thing of like feminism and social justice and the rest has just come and taken a shit all over everything that is lovely about poetry. But there is a certain type of Eastern European poet, like there's a book I have called is it called The Horse Has Six Legs? I think it is. It's translated and edited. It's old Serbian poetry by Charles Simic. Simic. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name if I were to do it properly in Serbo-Croatian, but I first read those, and I've seen some other poets that are like Croatian. Also some that are Hungarian. The names are not coming to me, but I've seen it. It appears with a number of Eastern European poets. They'll be talking about, bullet-riddled bodies and black bread and puppies barking from the womb. It's this crazy dark, it's just mad. I tried to cover some of the feeling that their poets create in me when I wrote a particular poem called The Music of Eastern Europe. So yeah, there are some that are out there. Many of them aren't coming to mind. But Charles Simic is one. In addition to the old Serbian poems he translated, he's written some of his own. Some of them I really like. One of them is called Evening Chess. And it's a short poem entitled Evening Chess. And it reads, "The Black Queen held high in my father's angry hand." I like those kind of very short images that strike, and you get a whole context from the smallest number of words. Let's see here. Facile Goose says, Semiogogue semiotic thoughts on Space Force Command logos. Read any Paul Celan poems? Translation nightmare. First off, no, I hadn't heard of Paul Celan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I have not looked at the Space Force Command stuff. I saw some people making fun of the fact that they're wearing camouflage. But I have not done an assessment of that. I suspect that it's going to be kind of depressing. You look at the different symbols. I think JAGCOR is pretty cool. It has like a pen and a sword. But the various military insignia, some of them are there's the whole mess of the caduceus. The caduceus being a symbol of medicine, even though it's supposed to be a symbol of commerce, is a whole story about how people in the military didn't understand the meaning of the symbol fully and kind of stretched it in certain ways that have caused unending confusion since. So I'll take a look, but my hopes are not high simply because I don't think there's much of anything involved with the military, much of anyone involved with the military that knows anything about semiotics or applies it. The only time that there's any sort of saving grace there, it's when the military, being quite conservative and traditional, carries over an older symbol. So it's not important whether or not they understand it. It's only important that they carry it forward in time, and therefore it still maintains some old meaning, but they're usually oblivious to it. But I will check out this fellow, Paul Celan. Okay, let's see here. Boomer says, Semiogogue, what's your favorite Jules Verne story? I don't know that I've ever even read one. I've always seen them, interpreted in like kids' films and things, but I never actually sat down to read one, I'm sorry to say. Binary Epidemic says, Semiogogue, what do you think of Yankee migrations to the South? Do you see it as a net positive or potentially disastrous? Those goddamn Yankees. It's like we say, they're like, what is it? They're like, it's just one of those fucking horrible jokes of Tim's. They're like hemorrhoids that come down and they don't go back up. Fucking carpetbaggers. It depends on the Yankee, really, because I've met Yankees I like from Maine. I've met them from Vermont. And I tend to think that in the northern parts of New York and in New Hampshire, that there are probably some very cool people. I had a friend from an old Southern family who moved up to New England and, you know, outside the big cities, and she got along great with like the old women in that milieu. You know, they have this whole thing of self-reliance. They don't like bullshit. They're educated. So if you mean Yankee in that sense, now that's one thing. But the other thing is that the South, because it had sort of been left alone, left to just kind of rot after not restoration, Reconstruction. It hasn't been turned to complete shit yet. We still have forests. It's not like, you know, where the sprawl begins with Richmond going north, certainly beginning with Baltimore, where it's all like horrible brick houses and cast iron and cities and claustrophobic structures and all the rest. The South is still pretty open and green. And as a result, you've got people, I looked at some figures for the city I'm in, and they're put together by the Chamber of Commerce for the metro area, and it showed the people who are moving in, and it's like people from Michigan, and if it's the Upper Peninsula, sure, come on down. The Germans up there are great rednecks. I want them. But a lot of people from California, a lot of people from Texas, a lot of people from New York. So they're just making it it's whoever had that expression about the anywheres. They're just more anywhere people. They don't belong anywhere. They don't change anything. It's all just a strip mall, an endless strip mall from one end of the globe to the other, and they all have Starbucks in them. So if you were going to send me a bunch of old school Yankees, like Yankee proper as New England, it wouldn't bother me all that much, and I might even welcome it. But in terms of just the anywheres coming here and you know, driving up property prices and packing our roads with traffic, you know, I'm not really for that. SD asks about Semiogogue, your view on Henri Corbin's theory of imagination as an organ of theophanic apperception. I'm very much into Corbin, very much. There's one on the creative imagination visit, and there's one on God, the titles aren't coming to my mind, and they should. I mean, obviously there's The Man of Light, which is excellent. There's Temple and Contemplation, which I've read. There's Avicenna and the Visionary Recital, which I think I half read and need to come back to and finish. But there's Swedenborg. It's a little book, and it's all about creative imagination and Swedenborg and Ibn al-Arabi or something. God, I can't remember all of it. But yes, the whole business of those particular explorations of ideas that we call Neoplatonic, and the idea of the imaginal as entirely distinct from the imaginary, I am a big fan of. In point of fact, I consider Henri Corbin to be one of the few people that write about things that are supposed to be metaphysical or esoteric or whatever, who actually has something to say that isn't a waste of my time. I have the highest respect for him. In fact, I have Henri Corbin and Francis Yates up at the top of my, and Mary Carruthers up at the top of my people who write useful books on esoteric subjects. All right, I see that Gaius Nullus is Hungarian Nullus, so yes, I'd be happy to talk to you about poetry. Mystical Gladness, Semiogogue, hearing this often these days, what is your opinion of escaping America to the Republic of Georgia? While the getting is good and fiat currency is at high exchange. Republic of Georgia, you're talking about Georgia and the Caucasus? I'd be in no rush to go there. In fact, I'd probably go to Abkhazia first, particularly since they haven't sorted out the business of the Georgian military highway, you know, Yermolov's old route down south through the Caucasus. And with all the pipeline warring going on over territorial control and who gets to articulate energy networks in that area, I'd wait a bit before I went to Georgia, if that's the Georgia you're talking about. Let's see here. What is next here? King Salmon Fish says, Semiogogue, for the record, I have been laid and do get women pretty well. Just how do we get more positive masculinity in our culture? I'm so glad to hear that you get laid. I, too, have been laid in my life. But the central question, how do we get a more positive masculinity in our culture? You have to give some thought to what that means, and it's beyond testosterone. Now, you can't leave out testosterone. You can't leave out a certain amount of knuckle dragging because it's necessary, because the no is as important as the yes. I don't know. That's not an easy question. I'd have to give a good bit of thought to that. I certainly think that it amounts to that we're going to have to do quite a bit more than, like, you know, read Iron John or Fire in the Belly or have drum circles where we all cry. Okay. Let me see here. Questions. We have a half an hour left if you guys still have questions coming. If not, I can cut as well. We shall see what you present me with. Semiogogue, this is from John Ski. France seems to be on the brink of collapse. See Base Poland Twitter. Thoughts? I have been looking at what's going on in France. And France was a place that long ago, when talking with Tim, I said that might well be one of the ones that breaks. And the amount of pressure that's on them now is just enormous. And we know from not just the 1860s, if I'm remembering correctly, the first time they said, let's go to the barricades, but the 1960s too. Maybe I'm wrong about the 1860s. Les Miserables. What period was that? Someone will be able to tell me. Anyway, there are people who are more than willing to get riled up, being Celtic at core, which a lot of people forget. They're a little hot-tempered, and they can go off half-cocked, and it looks like they're fitting too. So we'll see what happens. I think there's going to be a combination with trouble in France and Brexit going through, which leaves them in sort of a quagmire in terms of finances. I think it's all going to come together. And that's why I'm watching what's going on in Libya, because, and in particular with the Turks allowing for large numbers of so-called refugees to enter Europe from the east. And now that they're getting involved in all this crap going on with Lebanon, as you guys have probably heard me discuss in previous conversations about geopolitics and strategy, I'm watching all that now because France, Brexit, you know, collapse of financial sectors. Take a look, for example, at how the German automotive industry is doing, you know, and then if you throw in more migrants, it could very well turn into something that's very, very exciting indeed. Wow, it's crazy. I'm getting older now. I guess my eyes get lighter. They used to be more brown than green, but now they're more green than brown. You can see my little stripe in my eye. It's crazy. Wow, finally going to have green eyes. Or the green will come out more than the brown. All right. Whoa, what there was something about a Serbian war. Where did it go? Good God. I'm lost now. Alexander Dresden says, Semiogogue, have you published your poetry? Some of it has been published. You can find it online. It's been published in a handful, very small number, 2, 3 poetry journals, some in print, some online. You can find it if you search. But I have a book of poetry, which is now pretty much ready. A friend of mine did a review of it carefully for me. Did, you know, look for errors and problems. So I'm pretty much done. I just need to do one last pass through it. I've even got it typeset and everything. And then I have a poet friend of mine who's, you know, much more well-known and who's been published many times and won big awards and things, Robinson Jeffers Award. And I'm hoping she will be willing to write a little blurb on the back for me. So that's really what I'm waiting on. Some of it is out there now in answer to your question, but I'm about to publish the bulk of it in a book of poetry that I will self-publish and make available. You'll hear about it on the channel. Okay. Yes, okay, I'm coming back down here. I got lost. Somebody's talking about the IWI Tavort S12 shotgun. Starship Trooper gun for the Space Force. I have a couple Mossberg 500s, and they're simple, they're easy. Okay. Prism says, Chopin? or Liszt. Chopin is interesting to me, but to be honest with you, and everybody just looks at me like I'm crazy when I say it. Maybe I need to listen to more. Excuse me. I'm not sure whether I have a frog or a toad in my throat. The only piano, just hearing piano, there's something about the fact that the string isn't plucked, that it's hammered, that the string is hammered. I don't like the sound of piano. It sounds awful. And that's an awful thing to imagine because you've really got two tempered instruments, the piano and the guitar. I want to like piano more, but I've never listened to any piano I enjoy with the sole exception of Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff is fucking badass. So when people say Chopin or Liszt, my response is Rachmaninoff. I'm tone deaf too, by the way. All right, now I'm getting down here. Horatius 763, Semiogogue. What do you believe the American involvement in the Serbian war was about in the grand chessboard? It was trying to peel off Yugoslavia. Yugoslav just means South Slav. So it's basically the entire southern bloc of the Slavs in Europe, and it was an attempt to peel them off and to keep them Balkanized. It's just, it creates a kind of a created kind of ulcerating sore that prevents that area from developing economically until they get around to doing it in the way that they want to. And if you've looked, just within the last year, I believe there's an Alex Soros paid for editorial in the New York Times that talked about how the time had come to deal with, things like Macedonia and Albania, and now the time has come to pour all that money in. I think it was to block Russian influence there. It was to disconnect, or to carve this little chunk off so that they can, balkanize it further and do what they want with it, because the Serbs looked like they were going to have a considerable amount of influence in the region, and they would basically eject the so-called Kosovars and basically separate these problematic, let's not say problematic population, separate these populations whose continued cheek by jowl existence was very problematic. This whole thing with bringing in the hordes and hordes of migrants into Europe and just acting like they're going to be able to sit there and whistle Dixie and everything will be, I guess that's not the right metaphor, whistling Dixie, as regards segregation and the rest. To think that they can sit there and just hum a cheerful tune and that everything will work out okay after we saw the population exchanges after World War I, where you had just hundreds of thousands of Muslims pushed out of what's now Greece and areas of the Balkans to get them over into Turkey. And likewise, you had hundreds of thousands of Christians. They called them Greeks, but they're really Rum. They were Asia Minor. They were Anatolian Greek speakers that were driven out. The massive upheaval involved with those population exchanges in the Balkans and in Anatolia, which are as recent as the 1920s. And then you got a reminder about the problems with all these heterogeneous people living side by side, to say nothing of the sectarian issues, because obviously, people will argue with you about it, but more or less, the only difference between a Croatian and a Serbian and a Boshnak is the Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox. I get it. There are bloodline issues and the rest, and there are cultural differences, but they're all Yugoslavs. They're all South Slavs. And with the recent trouble, even Tito couldn't hold it together, though he did a pretty damn good job given the hand that he had been dealt. You can't even keep those things together. And it's like no one has taken a look at the massive population upheaval of the 1920s after World War I. I almost want to do a clip just on that to be like, how the fuck did you people forget this thing that happened only 100 years ago? How is it that you all are sitting here thinking that this is going to, this is going to work out just fine. Diversity is our strength. Anyway, I went off on a tangent. I think the United States and the European Union at that time, the EU was allowing it to all happen to go after the Serbs because they were worried about both Chinese and Russian influence in the Balkans. I think the U.S. supported it because they knew that they could kind of leave it there as a bone that was broken that wouldn't be reset, that would act as a drag, as I said before, until they got their act together and decided how they wanted to come in on it. Remember, all that at the time would have been a strategy that would be related to trying to take over Ukraine and the rest, and a number of moves had changed on the board. Adherent of Lady Columbia says, Semiogogue, how do you approach research? I've been trying to acclimate a better method of approach, and yours seems to have a wide and deep reach in matters. Any tips? All I can tell you, because there's no specific context and we'd have to go into all kinds of details otherwise, when you sit down with a puzzle, you don't just start trying to put two pieces together. You try to figure out where the edges of the puzzle are. You try to find out where the corners are, and you get that laid out first, which is all about context. So, for example, through considering the great game board, and to stick with my metaphor, that would be equivalent to trying to set up the corners and the edges, always remembering nihil novum sub solis, there's nothing new under the sun. So whatever it is you're going to go after, you have to try to take a view that establishes context first. But that said, it's only first by an instant, because induction and deduction have to be working in parallel. Okay, what's next? Oh, wait, are we down at the bottom? I thought I just found a... Huh. Good God, there are a ton of them down here. Huh. Sorry, guys. Okay, I'm catching up. My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. Andrew asks, Semiogogue, have you been following this grooming gang scandal in England? I'm from the far north of Scotland, and I cannot believe people are letting this happen. Never heard anything like it. Yeah, you're closer to it than I am. I think that there are going to be, that we are now approaching the limits of how much they can attempt to sweep it under the rug, because I've seen now with the release of the report on the events in Manchester, you know, we used to talk about Rotherham, where it's 1,400, and that's a conservative estimate of quote unquote groomed. By that, I mean kidnapped, drugged, raped, tortured, abused. You had 1,400 women, and that being a conservative estimate in Rotherham. And we're not talking about Rochdale. We're not talking about Telford. And there are more, many more, not just Manchester. But in Manchester, was it Manchester or was it in England in general? I just heard some figures about 19,000 in a year. Do I have that right? Am I getting 2019 confused with it somehow? It's some absolutely staggering figure. And, you know, the more you flip rocks, the more you find out that there are worms underneath. It's just, it's horrifying. And the fact, as I started to say, that we're now seeing the BBC talk about it, and even talking about whether or not it makes sense. Can you imagine the BBC saying, does it make sense to call them Asians when it's really Pakistanis? Like, they know there's no more room to wiggle around. So it's kind of like the kid who's been caught lying. So they're like, I cannot tell a lie, father. Well, yeah, because you just got caught. And I think part of it has to do as well with the whole possibility of having the refusal to pay the BBC licensing fee if you have a television, decriminalizing that. I think the BBC has been put on notice. So, you know, a lot of people give Tommy Robinson a bunch of shit, and I get why. Nevertheless, the guy did yeoman work for raising awareness about these issues. I get that he went all off into La La Land like Katie Hopkins did with, you know, are we talking about Britain or are we talking about Israel here? Which one is it? Right? Let's be clear. That acknowledged, it's weird to see this stuff on the BBC, because I'm thinking back just to like 2 years ago when people were laughing Tommy Robinson off or sneering and the rest. I mean, the whole situation's changing there. And I think it will change quite a bit more. Not to mention that Britain historically has always been in a situation where there's crazy upheaval on the continent, and they kind of take their guidance about what they're going to do from their insular view as those who stand apart looking at the continent. And in addition to all the stuff that's coming to the surface and all the attempts to sweep it under the rug that are no longer adequate to the task, I think shortly in Britain, they'll be looking across the channel at more craziness breaking out on the continent. And that is going to cause them to turn with even more resolve to these issues, and hopefully with an eye towards coming up with resolutions that are not short-term band-aids, but long-term, like, let's settle this once and for all. to whatever extent that's possible. So that was in response to Andrew's question. Thank you for it. Stoli the Wise. Semiogogue, have you ever read into Jesuit missions in China and how they noted back in the 16th century that it would be a perfect culture to adapt to create Plato's Republic? And is Kissinger Satan? I don't know if Kissinger's Satan. No, I haven't read what you're talking about with the Jesuit missions. The only point of reference I have is the book called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. And he's a 17th century Jesuit, I want to say, who went to China and tried to get them to pick up our techniques of the art of memory to help the mandarins there pass their imperial exams to be a part of the bureaucracy there. But I should look into that. See, now, we just had someone, who was it that was asking the question? It was adherent of Lady Columbia. How do you approach research? As soon as somebody like Stoli the Wise tells me this thing about Jesuit missions to China and how they noted back in the 16th century it'd be the perfect culture to adapt to create Plato's Republic, I jump over and I think, yeah, Plato's Republic is arguably an early form of argument in favor of a kind of communism, which is doubtless, Stoli the Wise certainly had that in mind when he asked the question, or she. So I jump down this thing and I go, wow, this could be a way to see why, for example, the US State Department thought it was a great idea to go into China and to basically erode the position of the KMT and, see them driven out to Taiwan and to help Mao to drive his project forward. So yeah, one way is, and Stoli the Wise provides the example, one way adherent of Lady of Columbia is to look for the roots in the past, but be willing to look far enough and in unexpected ways, because how many people would normally, I'm not saying I thought of it, Stoli the Wise brought the topic up. Nevertheless, it's not a common thing to say, wow, maybe we could look for the roots of communist intrigue in China in Jesuit actions from, 300 years back. All right. Binary Epidemic says, Semiogogue Tesla had a theory that eyes get lighter over age if you become more intelligent. I'd probably, if I took an IQ test now, I would be inclined to think that it would be lower. I have more wisdom, but less sprightly intelligence, if that's possible. Mystical Gladness says, Semiogogue, can you comment on current geopolitical manipulations in the Orthodox Church? Ukraine and Serbia is ramping up. I have no damn idea. I would guess maybe somebody who is in that church. Isn't Jay Dyer Orthodox and a big proponent of Orthodox Christianity? I just don't know enough about it. I'd love it if you could point me to some things that would get me oriented. But Christianity in general, I only know a bit about, probably a lot more than many people, but by any standard, I'm more or less ignorant. And that is particularly the case for the Orthodox Church, or the various Orthodox churches, I should say. All right. Horatius 763, why did the US get involved? Oh, we already did this. Oh no, this is another question about Serbia. I think I kind of answered that one already. Boomer says, Semiogogue, do you think new caravan of migrants will break through Mexican forces and get to the US border? Yeah, maybe. Maybe. At this point, it's just a couple hundred, as I hear. Mr. Xme is saying, Chopin! See, those are those people who are like, how can you not understand how great Chopin is? And yes, I am a harpsichord man. I like me some Bach. Flower Tower says, thanks for the stream. Well, thank you for joining us. Semiogogue says, Floyd Kramer. I don't know what that means. Vlad says, Rachmaninoff Prelude is badass. All Rachmaninoff is just badass. I saw an interesting one I posted on Twitter recently where they adapted one of Rachmaninoff's compositions for pipe organ. And that was just like, wow, man. Yeah, but you kind of have to be there live for that. And oddly enough, the person who introduced me to Rachmaninoff, I used to sit in the basement while he was on his Kawai Baby Grand, and he was working on parts of Rachmaninoff's third concerto. So I got to sit there and watch it and listen to it live in this tiny room, surrounded by venomous serpent cages and the rat cages where he was raising them for food. And he collected serpents, he did Olympic-style weightlifting, and he played Rachmaninoff. He had perfect pitch. which apparently was a misery for him. He was always bitching about how his teacher would be like, pitch, tell him to make the tone. But he had studied pipe organ and then had gone over to Rachmaninoff. So I got to hear it live, man. It's just like, man, in this closed room with the piano, roaring. El Vaquero 555. Semiogogue, notice, hello, sir, by the way. Notice that in the Yugoslav wars, we always sided with the Muslims. 5 will get you 10. That goes back to the petrodollar arrangement with Saudi Arabia. Maybe. There's something about, the Balkans, it's always been a border region where, the eastern parts and the western parts of Eurasia come together. And there's the whole idea that it's a sort of a soft underbelly. There was Churchill's argument about, instead of D-Day, going up through the Balkans. It's a strategic place that all the great powers have been fucking about in for so long. And I certainly don't need to tell anyone who's from that part of the world. They grow up with it in their blood. That's why Greek can be so pissy still to this day. They're a little pissed at Italians, but they're really pissed at Germans. They don't like them at all. Don't like Americans much. I'm sure the same holds for, Serbia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro. They're just like, Turks, Germans, Russians. Depending on when you get them, they might like one or the other of those groups more than another, but right. Tchaikovsky is actually quite nice. There's some Tchaikovsky that's really good. Okay. What else do we have here? El Vaquero says, I have meerschaum in my teeth. What am I doing? You are smoking. Swamp Thing comments, says, Semiogogue, have you ever considered how to weed out opportunist grifters preemptively from an organization, movement, or club? I've given it a bit of thought, but I could just sort of give you scattershot impressions, and that is something that would have to be laid out carefully so that you've got the various elements set up and you can make sure it's kind of like overlapping fields of fire. You'd want redundancy. You'd have to think about short-term kind of things. You'd have to think of ways to set up little traps for people so that you could draw them in to identify them. You'd have to think about things at the front end that would make it less likely that they would come in. So there are all kinds of dimensions to that. Really, the intelligence services, why reinvent sliced bread? Why reinvent the wheel? With a little bit of research, even in the public domain, you could probably find quite a bit by looking historically at ways that the intelligence services vetted people. And then, cells, need to know, degrees of separation, that kind of stuff. Okay. No, greetings from Russia. Greetings back to you from Russia. I'm happy you are here. What is next? There's all this discussion going on in the background. Wow. Amanda Anderson's going wild. I'm glad there are moderators here. Dave Hughes in the house. Hello, sir. Farmers always welcome. What else here? Semiogogue, maybe a strange question, but how did you react to 9/11 when it happened? I was in the car on the way to work and I heard about it on the radio, and then I got in time to turn the TV on and see the second tower go down, as they like to say. And we called it a day at work, and I went home and got my basic stuff and packed my truck with it so that I could go out to the countryside if it looked like it was going to get worse. And it didn't. So I went home and unpacked it and watched. Mystical Gladness. What's the craziest story you have from your life so far? I'd have to give that some thought. We have about 6 minutes left, and I want to try to get to some more of these questions. So hopefully you won't take it personally. I haven't answered your questions, but that one I'm going to leave for later. Andrew, Semiogogue, maybe a strange. We got the 9/11 one. SD says, Semiogogue, what is the secret meaning of the Renaissance tractate Hypnerotomachia Polyphili? The dream of the soul in sleep. Yes, that's a very good question. What is the secret meaning? I have a von Franz, I believe, study of it, and I've got the Jocelyn Godwin translation of it. I have not done the proper study of it. It ties to the art of memory, though, and it has very much to do with the natural versus the artificial memory. Okay, let's see if we got a few more here. We're almost out of time, ladies and gentlemen. What ethnic background is Semiogogue? My mother's, that question from Thracian. I've answered this before, but I will do it again. My mother's mother, it's Greek and German, half and half. My mother's father was all Italian from Tuscany. He had one parent from Lucca and one parent from Pitigliano. So he was not Sicilian, which is sort of rare in the United States. He was a Tuscan Italian. So that's my mother's side is German, Greek, and Italian. My father's father was German and French, Catholic. And my father's mother was English and something British, Osborne with no E at the end. So I don't know if that's Scots. I'm assuming it's probably English. So yeah, I'm French, Greek, Italian, German, and English. I'm an American. I am a mutt. Okay. Could I leave you with the poem on Eastern Europe that I mentioned earlier? Black Pepper asks, Semiogogue, Türkçe biliyor musunuz? Of course he didn't say musunuz, he said musum. Biraz abi ama bu aralar konuşmuyorum. O yüzden her şeyi unutuyorum. İşte öyle, ne yapayım? Orthodox Zoomer, did Kurt Cobain kill himself? I have no idea. Flower Tower, do you think there's something behind the Asian blood group mysticism? I don't know what that is. Elvicaro says you might want to get yourself a nice boogaloo stick the way things are going. I have a variety of boogaloo sticks. I just don't need fancy black new ones. I have old-fashioned ones. Semiogogue, how's your Shakespeare? It seems the night preceding toil and trouble. Bubble, bubble, toil and trouble. I know a bit. I haven't read that much. I've read The Taming of the Shrew and Love's Labour Lost and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet and probably one or two more, but I have not read all of them as yet, but I will. What else? Will I ever do a Discord call-in show? This question from Palooka82. No. Nah. Discord I closed because it's just a big liability waiting. It's just a big liability waiting there to cause me problems. Guest in there said, were you born in the 50s or 60s? Fuck you, I was born in the 70s. Admittedly, the early 70s, 71, but yeah. Am I a fan of Mircea Eliade? Yes, and even more so of Ioan Culianu from Romania. All right. Then, yeah, I'm going to get this Music of Eastern Europe poem, and I'll read it for you fuckers, because we are about out of time. Let me find my poems. Poems. Well, that's coming up. Selected poems? No. Maybe they're in here. Let me see. We shall see. It's coming up. I will get a question while it's raised, while the application is booting. Semiogogue, can you please stand up, just turn around 3 times and sit down again? No. No. Yeah, no. It's the kind of thing you ask a lady to do so you can gain a deep understanding of who and what she is by being able to look at her ass. Women don't realize that, but men, they understand everything about you by looking at your ass and how you walk, which is precisely why I'm not going to do it for what appears to be a male. Okay. Elvicaro says, don't get me wrong, I have 2 M1 Grands, but I really, really love my AR-10. Well, 7.62 by 51, right? Garand's are nice, though. I thought about getting a, the Springfield M1, the M14. They just don't seem to be that stable. I'm looking at a AR platform, but I will probably do 5.56, just because it's lighter. You can carry more ammunition. Okay. Durden says, Semiogogue, we'd love to have you on Patrick Batesman's show, The Waffen House. I can't promise anything. I haven't looked at it. I have no idea what it is. I appreciate the invitation. If you're the actual decision maker, then get in touch with me. You can reach me at Semiogogue at Proton Mail and pitch me the idea. I'll take a look at the content and we'll see there. King Salmonfish, the Chad thing relates to promoting positive masculinity in our culture. Okay. Nostradamus says Osborne is Norman English from the southwest of England. Yes, but my Osborne has no E on the end. But yeah, I don't know. There's a, yeah, the one English side I trace back really far. They showed up in the US in 1754, which I guess you'd call a colonist / settler. And I have the French side arrived earlier. But these this Osborne, this family that went through Ohio and then out to Kansas with no E on the end, I can't trace them back further than like 1880 or something. So I don't know when they arrived. Okay, so we've come to the end of the evening. Let me see if I can find this Eastern Europe poem. And this will be it, ladies and gentlemen. Come now. There we are. So before I read this, somebody said, when will you get married and have little baby Semio elves? That depends on the quality of woman, and I'm now, God, I'm just a couple of years away from 50, so we'll see. That depends on the female. Bride Quest may come this year. We will see. Elvacaro, this is the last question I'm going to look at. Semiogogue 260 Remington, sea level max effective range 1,400 yards. See, you're out in the West. You're dealing with those big open spaces. I'm dealing with like brush guns and, you know, a low likelihood that I'm ever going to have to take a shot that's more than 100 yards. I mean, maybe 200 yards. So, yeah, I get it. I like it. I'd love to get. I had a Remington 700 270 that I inherited from my grandfather. My brother ended up with it though. I mean, if I'm worried about that, I'll get a stout like 308 or, you know, whatever, 338 Pua or what, or that other damn one. God, it's not coming to me because I'm thinking about poetry. I'd just get like a bolt action rifle with the scope if I wanted to really be able to reach out and touch someone. Otherwise, it's more, you know, short range. I'm sorry, reach out and touch my hunting quarry. You know, big game. But otherwise, it's more about like how much ammunition can you carry and how small and light is it, and that makes the 5.56 interesting. Okay, yeah, 6.5 Creedmoor. That's what I was trying to think of. Thank you, Stoli the Wise. So that's it. If I keep looking, this will go on for too long. I'm going to read this closing poem. I thank you all in advance for coming in. Once again, my apologies for the bullshit at the opening of this, with, you know, my constant boomer troubles with live streaming. So yeah, thank you all. This is the final poem. It's entitled The Music of Eastern Europe. This one goes out to all those viewers in Eastern Europe. Perhaps you will hear reflected in this something of your own lands and histories. Perhaps not, but this is my impression. The music of Eastern Europe. The boots of Sultan, Tsar, and Kaiser leave muddy prints on your mother's breasts. Fanged wooden spires rise like dog hackles from the deep snow that sometimes causes frost-riddled gypsies to drop from their trees like stiff and staring fruit. Your sad fiddles invoke immodest sorrow with merciless reliability because everyone is missing a string. In the frost-bitten hour before dawn, 10,000 tiny hussars flutter their wings in your crooked wells. They've been waiting for spring for centuries. Your dancing masters resort to strong drink and minefield choreographies to ensure their art survives. Your soil is fertile. Blood makes it black, like krvavica sausages, or the rings that stain Batory tubs. Every bandit is a prince, and every prince a bandit, with a bulge in his pants, formed by a fat roll of bills, or a glimpse of what might be red opera gloves, if it weren't for the dripping. And wolf brothels, where boards, beds, and babes all squeal like little pigs. Close your eyes and listen. The howling is beautiful.